The Soviet-Afghan War was a time of conflict and debate all over the world. Compromises between supporting countries led to an end to the conflicts between the Soviets and the Mujahideen. These groups were made up of Afghan rebels who wished to push the Soviets out of Afghanistan. This event has made an immense impact on Middle Eastern and American history. The Soviet Union, a powerful nation with an even more powerful government. They had been allied with the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan until a coup staged against President Nur Muhammad Taraki in September 1979. This event, preceded by several revolts accompanied by a civil war, caused the Soviets to send military aid to their southern ally. The new president, Hafizullah Amin, continued to accept the aid from the Soviets. Threat of a federal collapse was upon them, and they needed all of the assistance they could find. December 12, 1979. Imminent invasion. Conflict arose between the Soviets and the Afghans when intelligence reached the Politburo that Amin had been conspiring with the Americans on an alliance shift between the Soviets and Washington. Outraged, the Soviets decided to send soldiers to Afghanistan to seize political control over the country. In doing so, they hoped to restore their alliance and the balance of power in the Middle East between them and the Americans. Amin's government would soon fall, leaving the entire country in chaos.
Soviet troops fought pitched battles in the streets of Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan today. It was part of a successful effort to replace a pro-Moscow president of Afghanistan with a new leader who's even more pro-Moscow.
December 24th, 1979. Operation Storm 333. That was the name of the plan to capture and assassinate President Hafizullah Amin. After his betrayal of Soviet trust, the Soviets could no longer count upon him to retain their alliance. Therefore, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, marking the official beginning of the Soviet-Afghan War. It was on December 27, 1979, when Tajbek Palace was invaded by Soviet special forces. Amin was taken alive, but later died of wounds and poisoning inflicted during the invasion. In his place, the Soviets installed a puppet leader, Babrak Karmal, to lead Afghanistan and keep the alliance with the USSR. His leadership sparked an uprising, a rebellion, a resistance. January 28, 1980. The resistance ensues. Resistance intensified as multiple Mujahideen groups, who were supported with money and arms from the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, fought against Soviet forces and their Afghan allies. These groups were often unorganized in the beginning of the war, using simple guerrilla tactics to fend off the Soviets.
Apparently, the Soviets had felt that simply bringing in their tanks into the country would be enough to terrorize the population into submission. And seeing that this was not the case, they launched a total war attack. There was a wave of helicopter fire. Parachute troops were landed on the houses. Parachute troops went into the houses and simply shot everybody in them, forcing the population either to run away or die on the spot.
In the first 6 months of the campaign, the Soviets committed more than 80,000 soldiers to occupy Afghanistan and attack the resistance. The Soviets thought nothing of the Mujahideen rebellion, not yet. The United States' donation of weaponry and ammunition to the Mujahideen fighters caused major losses to Soviet aircraft and troops. Over the next 5 years, the Afghan resistance would prove to be successful, holding the Soviet power in Afghanistan to a minimum. July 1981. Moderate Mujahideen. The first organized faction of the Mujahideen is formed. 3 of the Mujahideen leaders, Molvi Nabi, Pir Gailani, and Hazrat Mujahideen, came together to form the Moderates, a group of Mujahideen whose purpose for resisting the Soviets were to defeat the atheist Soviet regime, enactment of Islamic law, and in an election for a new Afghan government.
We want to fulfill our duties, and if we are killed, we are killed in the way of God Almighty. So we haven't lost anything. It's a victory by itself.
They hoped that driving the Soviets out of Afghanistan would lead to a victory in their own civil war and a new, less corrupt government. August 1981. The Fundamentalist Faction. A second Mujahideen faction is formed. Like the formation of the moderates, four Mujahideen leaders came together to organize a group of Mujahideen based on their values, the fundamentalists. These leaders were Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Motri Khalis, Burhanuddin Rabbani, and Abdul Rasul Sayyaf. These leaders believed in an Iran-style revolution and government. They wanted to overthrow the government as well as the Soviet power in Afghanistan. These factions seemed very different from one another. They both had one thing in common, however. They both wanted to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan. February 2nd, 1983. American aid. The Americans have publicized their support of the Afghan rebellion. In a journal entry from Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States, he describes his experience with the Mujahideen. Finally had a visit with 6 Afghan freedom fighters here in this country to tell of the inhumanity of the Soviets. The Russians had burned 105 people alive with gasoline and chemicals in an irrigation tunnel. Reagan declares March 21st, Afghanistan Day, in support of the Afghan rebellion. By the end of 1983, the Mujahideen had about 80,000 full-time combatants. September 1986. Stinging the Soviets. A Stinger missile is a portable, shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile first supplied by the Americans to the Mujahideen rebels in September of 1986. This highly effective anti-aircraft missile launcher was a huge asset to the Mujahideen. Even if they didn't hit their target, they caused the Soviets to change their tactics, either flying higher to avoid the missile's range or flying lower, since the missile could not be fired downwards. It is estimated that the CIA supplied the Mujahideen with about 2,300 Stingers and even more ammunition to accompany them. November 11th, 1986. A phased fallback. In a meeting with the Soviet Politburo, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev proposes a phased pullout. In his address, he urged the Politburo to begin plan for withdrawal in 1987 and gradually remove troops from Afghanistan for 2 years. September 1987. A new leader in Afghanistan. After he was installed as the Communist Party chief in May 1986, Mohammad Najibullah becomes the head of state in Afghanistan. Most of Babrak Karmal's accountability in the Soviet Union has diminished, as did his power in the Afghan government. Najibullah called for reform in the Afghan government. As a result, Afghanistan adopted a new constitution. They held parliamentary elections the following year, electing new representatives. Najibullah hoped this would settle the Mujahideen down so the Soviets could withdraw peacefully.
Received a briefing from my national security advisors on the contents of the proposed Geneva agreements on Afghanistan that would provide for the complete withdrawal of Soviet occupation forces from that country.
April 14th, 1988. Compromise. The Geneva Accords are signed at the United Nations. These documents included several compromises, including a mutual peace treaty between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. In the agreement between the Soviets and the Americans, the Soviets agreed to withdraw from Afghanistan if the United States stopped sending military aid to the Mujahideen. This was the beginning of the fulfillment of Gorbachev's plan to withdraw from Afghanistan. February 15th, 1989. The final Soviet. The last Soviet occupying Afghanistan crosses the border back into the Soviet Union. Afghan civilians line the streets in joy as they are liberated from the invaders they so feared. However, this war took a huge toll on both countries. It is estimated that about 1.5 million Afghan civilians were killed. 5 million refugees had fled the country. 32,000 pro-Soviet troops were killed. 80 to 90,000 Mujahideen were killed, and 75,000 were wounded in action. The Soviet-Afghan War left a developing country in disarray. War had tested alliances among neighbors and, after many deaths, had ended in a compromise that well suited all nations involved.